Hey everyone, welcome to this JavaScript for Beginners course. This is the first part in a multi-part series of getting started with JavaScript. So if you're new to coding or you want to switch over to JavaScript, this is a great way to do it. Let's go ahead and dive in. So setup for this course is really simple. You're just going to type into the bar up top, JS space REPL, and hit enter. And you're going to click on the first option. It's Node.js Online Compiler. That's fine. We want to learn JavaScript. That's what we want. So let that load, and once it's done loaded, then you're set to go. That's the entire setup for this course, right? So there's a couple things I guess to look at here. This in the middle is where we're going to type our code. On the right hand side it says Node up top here. That's just a version of Node JavaScript we're using. That's fine. This is called the console. This is where we're going to get our results out. So when we say, hey, I want to write something here, when we say I'm going to print something, then it comes out over here on the right side in the console. On the left hand side here, you've got this file, and this file is called index.js, and that's what we're using here to type out our code, or we're going to be using to type out our code. We can add new files and new folders, which we'll get to eventually. And then on the far left hand side here, there's just some options. Version control, we don't need to worry about right now. Packages, same thing, don't need to worry about them. Settings, if you're interested in how your REPL's laid out here, you can try stacked if you prefer that, and your console will be down on the bottom instead of up here. Or you can do side by side. I'm going to stick with side by side. There's also a theme, right? If you don't like this light theme, you can change yours to dark. And a lot of people prefer the dark theme, whatever you prefer. I'm going to stick with the light for now. Change the font size. Indent type, we're going to leave that as spaces. It's fine. Size 2, it's fine. All the rest, we're just going to leave as fine. I would say the main thing is if you don't want the light theme, you can just change it to dark, right? That's totally up to you. So now that we kind of have the setup of how this REPL's laid out, let's go ahead and write our first hello world in JavaScript. Okay, so to do that, we're in our file here, and to be able to print something or write something to this console over here, we need to say console, C-O-N-S-O-L, and you're going to see it auto-completes for me. If you want to use that autocomplete, you can hit your tab key, and it'll finish it for you, dot, and we're going to say dot log. And you'll notice there's more than dot log. There's all these options here, so you can play around with those if you want, but we'll just say console.log. And inside, then we need to make these parentheses, okay? So you have to have parentheses when you're using console.log and you go to print something to the console. So parentheses, and then we're going to say quotes, single quotes, okay? You can use double quotes like this, or you can use single quotes. I'm going to stick with single quotes. That's just my preference. And I'm going to say hello world, exclamation point. And then at the end of your line, you're going to put a semicolon. Okay, and a semicolon just says we are done, right? And there's also a thing that you can get into eventually where you don't need semicolons, but we're going to use semicolons for now to say, hey, we are done with this line. So we have console.log hello world. When we click this run button, we're going to see, hopefully, hello world appear over here on the right-hand side in the console. So let's click run. And you've written your first hello world. So now that we've written our first program, right, we can run that as many times as we want. We can click this green button to run it again and again, and you'll see it just keeps refreshing, right? So we're just rerunning the program. We can also clear this console. So if this gets messy and there's a lot of stuff in here, we can use this clear button over here on the right, and it will get rid of the console. We could rerun it then. It's back, clear it. Okay, so that's how clear and running your program works. Now we don't have to just console.log one thing, right? What if we wanted to say more than hello world? We wanted to say hello to like 2 other people, right? So underneath hello world, I could also say console.log hello Austin. And then underneath that, I could also say console.log hello Joe. So you're allowed to put as many statements in a row as you want in the console. So you don't have to just say one thing. You can say, I want to log all 3 of these things, and they'll run in order. So when a program runs, it runs from top to bottom. So it's going to run the first line first, then the next line, then the third line. So the computer just looks at that first line. It says, hey, what do you want me to do? In this case, I want you to print hello world. So it prints it. Then it looks at line 2. What do you want me to do? Print hello Austin. Prints it. Looks at line 3, same thing, prints hello Joe. So when we run this, it should say hello world, hello Austin, and hello Joe in that order. So let's click run. Okay, and you'll see all 3 of these come up in order. So now let's take this, let's keep these three console.logs and let's make some, I'm going to call it ASCII art. And ASCII art is just kind of using symbols and characters to create something bigger. And I'll show you what that means in just a second. So let's go up here to the first one. We're going to create a 3-tier, kind of 3-line tall word high. So it's going to be about 3 lines tall. So to make that, we're going to use the pipe symbol. If you push shift, and it's / shift and forward, or maybe it's backslash, either way. And so shift and / you're going to get that pipe symbol. And then underneath, same thing, we're going to make a really tall word high. So there's the left side of the H, right? And then we can say, do something like that, add some spaces, right? Now this is more artsy, and we're trying to make a big letter H. So there's the H. Then let's make the I, right? All right, and so now when this prints, it's still going to print this line first, then this line, then this line, but it should look like a big word high. So let's go ahead and clear this console and run this. And yeah, so it prints this really big, kind of neat ASCII art word high. So now let's talk about variables in JavaScript, okay? And to do that, we're going to kind of set up a short story to do that. So, and we're going to set up that short story in console.log. So let's get rid of what we have. Let's clear the console, and let's console.log ourselves a short story, and then we're going to use variables in that story. So here we go. I'm going to type it out with you. Go ahead and take your time, pause when you need to. First thing is going to be console.log. We're going to say Dudley received 36 gifts for his birthday. That's the first line. Semicolon, right, to end the line, console.log. And this is just good practice for logging stuff. 36 gifts, Dudley thought out loud. But last year, and I'm going to move this over so we have more room and it stays on one line. But last year, I had 37. So Dudley's upset, console.log. And then we're going to write our third line of the story. And in this case, we'll say Dudley threw a tantrum. And then our last line is going to say console.log. He proceeded to knock all the gifts off the table. All right, so that's our story. Dudley received 36 gifts for his birthday. 36 gifts, Dudley thought out loud, but last year I had 37. He threw a tantrum, and he proceeded to knock all the gifts off the table. So now, let's talk about variables and how we can use these to our advantage, right? So we could say Dudley did this, Dudley did that, and Dudley did this. But what if then all of a sudden it's not Dudley and it's Joe, right? And Joe did this. So I would have to come in here and I would say Joe received 36 gifts. Joe thought out loud. And Joe threw a tantrum, right? And we know we don't want to go through all that. So I'm just going to Control Z and back that up. I'm also going to change this to a lowercase t. So we don't want to have to change Dudley every single time individually in our code. So we can fix that by creating what's called a variable. So we'll store the name Dudley inside of what's called a variable. And then we can use that variable in place of Dudley everywhere. And that'll allow us to have to type less, right? Lazy is good sometimes. So for example, above our console.logs here, I'm going to say let name, because Dudley's a name, right? You always want to name your variable with after something that makes sense. So if we're going to store Dudley inside of this variable, and the variable is called name, we don't want to say let my item equal Dudley. My item equal Dudley, that doesn't really make any sense. And then we can come down here and say my item, but it doesn't make any sense. Let's say let name, because Dudley's a name. So it takes this string, okay? A string is anything that's wrapped inside of quotes. In this case, these quotes. So Dudley is a string. If it wasn't a string, like that, it could be a number like 34 or 35, then it would be a number. But if it's inside of these quotes, it's a string. And you'll see I use double quotes here and single quotes here. It doesn't matter which you use. That's totally up to you. So I'll switch back to single quotes just to stay consistent. And this string Dudley gets stored inside of this name variable. So this name now holds the string Dudley. And to use that, to use the power of that, I can now add that string this name down inside of our console here. So instead of saying Dudley received 36 gifts, I could say, let's do this, name plus received 36 gifts. So name is Dudley, right? This is the string. So it'll still say Dudley. I just stored it inside a name, received 36 gifts. And then down here in the next line, notice Dudley's in the middle this time. So what I have to do is I have to break these strings up. So I can say space, okay, quote, and then I can say instead of Dudley, we're going to say plus name. And the plus sign is concatenation. So that means we are combining two strings together. Concatenation is a fancy word for it. So we're just putting these things together. We want to use 36 gifts and name together. So plus name plus, and then we're going to add another quote here. So there we go. So it's 36 gifts, space, name, space, thought out loud. But last year I had 37. And instead of name is in place of Dudley. And down here it's the same thing. So instead of Dudley, we can say name plus. All right. Now if we save this and run it, okay, you can do save and run. I'm just going to click run. And it should print out our story. And you notice it's not going to say name received 36 gifts. 36 gifts name thought out loud. It's Dudley, right? So we put name in here. That's our variable. But Dudley is inside of that name, so it replaces name with Dudley when it runs it. So there it is, Dudley, Dudley, and Dudley. Now, the other thing is, instead of, remember initially we wanted to replace everything with Joe, and we had to go through and say Joe, Joe, Joe. Now if we want name to be Joe, up top here, instead of saying Dudley, we can just say Joe. And we can click run. And you know what, let's clear this first. Clear. We'll click run. And now you're going to see everywhere in here, where there's the name variable, it's replaced with Joe. So instead of having to manually go through and replace every time we see Dudley with Joe, we just use this name variable and we can replace it all at once up top. So let's switch it back to Dudley, clear, and run. And you can see all the instances of Joe are now Dudley. Now let's replace one more thing in our story. So here we have 36 gifts and 36 gifts, right? So let's replace this 36 with, we'll call it number of gifts. And we're going to make that a variable. So underneath let name equal Dudley, we're going to say let number, we'll say num of gifts. So number of gifts equal, and we're going to put it inside of a string, 36. So quotes 36. Remember I said we could write a number like this, but because we're using it inside of quotes here, we're just going to leave it as a string also. So make sure you have it inside of quotes, so it's a string. Number of gifts equals 36. And we're going to replace 36 with number of gifts now. So we're going to do the same concept, plus num of gifts, plus, and then, there we go. And then we're also going to replace it here, right? So instead of that, we're going to say num of gifts plus. And again, I'm going to move this over just so we can see it on one line. Okay, so everywhere I had 36, I replaced with this num of gifts variable. And when we run it, we should still get the exact same story, right? So run. Right, okay, so 36 and 36 is where num of gifts is. And now instead of 36, what if Dudley received like 44 gifts, right? 44, run. Okay, so now all the 36s are changed to 44, and maybe his name is Joe. So Joe received 44. All right, so now all the Dudleys are replaced with Joe, and all the 36s are replaced with 37. If I Control Z that, just to see it one more time, now everything's back to Dudley and 36. So that's the power of using variables. Now with variables, you can change these halfway through. So maybe the name changes, or the number of gifts changes partway through our story. So underneath our second console log here, I can say then name equals, and let's change our name to Joe here. So now we're saying name is now Joe. And remember, the computer runs everything in order, right? So it says let name equal Dudley, let number of gifts equal 36. And then it says Dudley, 36, 36, Dudley. And then name equals Joe. So name is now Joe. So this line's going to say Joe, plus threw a tantrum. So it's going to say Joe threw a tantrum instead of Dudley. So you're allowed to change these as you go down through the code. And since it runs it in order, everything underneath where you changed it will have the changed variable. So let's run it, take a look. Right, so Dudley, 36 gifts Dudley thought out loud, right? And here's the third line, Joe threw a tantrum, right? So the name changed. And notice we didn't have to use let before name this time. Usually when you're declaring a variable, you have to say let. And in this case, we don't have to say let because we already said let up top. We're just now changing what's inside of let. And so that's okay to do. We could also do the same with number of gifts, right? So maybe here, instead of 36 gifts, maybe num of gifts equals, let's say 32, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's there. So initially number of gifts is 36. Then on this line, we change it to 32. So everything underneath that, in this case, this will now be 32. So we run it. Yeah. So Dudley received 36 gifts, and then it says 32 gifts. Dudley thought out loud. And remember down here, we changed Joe also. So you're allowed to change variables. I'm just going to Control Z that back. You're allowed to change these variables as you go throughout your code. So one more thing, there's one more way to say I'm going to make a variable. Instead of saying let, you could say const. So you could say const name and const number of gifts. And so what's the difference between let and const? So const means I am not going to change this. This is always going to be the same thing, and it kind of forces the computer to keep it the same. If you know you're making a variable, if you know name is always going to be Dudley and number of gifts is always going to be 36, then use const, because if it's not going to change, don't allow it to change. So for example, if I come down here and I try and say name equals Joe, because I'm using this const keyword in front of name, now it's going to throw an error in the console here. And by throw an error, I mean it's going to throw a lot of red out on the screen. So let's run it and see. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of stuff here, right? But the important thing is it says assignment to constant variable, and it tells us where it's at. So at, and it says 7, 6. So let's see. At 7, so line 7. And my guess would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about the 6th space. It's not exactly, but the 7's the important one. So at the 7th line, we tried to reassign Dudley to Joe. And it says, hey, we can't do that because we know in our program it's always going to be Dudley. So if you know that something's not going to change, then always use const. So const is the variable, the keyword you want to use in front of declaring a variable. So always use const if you know it's not going to change. And if it is going to change, then we'll use let. So if 36 is supposed to change, if the number of gifts, then we would definitely use let. If we wanted to change it down here, then we could say number of gifts. So if you want something to change, use let. If you know it never will change and you're pretty sure it never will change, just use const. You can always go back and change it to let later. Now let's talk about comments. And comments are something you use for you to see and me to see, or for other developers to see, but the computer can't see them. The computer just completely ignores comments in JavaScript. And by comment, I mean this. So you can say something like dash dash, and notice it turns gray, right? If I were to just say, this is my code, notice it's not gray, right? That means the computer can still see this. Or if you're using a code editor, it's probably green. If it's not green or gray, the computer can probably see it. So to make it a comment and say, hey, this is just for me to read, it's not for the computer, don't read it, computer, I just want this here for my notes, right? So you can say dash dash // and space. And you don't have to add the space, but it looks better with the space. And so it makes this whole line gray. And that says to the computer, hey, don't read this. This is for me only. And we can prove that by saying console.log hi, and then console.log bye. And remember, the computer reads from top to bottom, right? So to read line 1, 2, and 3. But since 2 is a comment, it's not going to read that line. It's just going to skip over that. So you're going to see hi, bye, and this line will just get ignored. So let's run it. Yeah, and we get hi and bye, and it just ignores that line too. So that's a comment. You can, of course, have more than one line. This is my second comment. You can have as many lines of comments as you want. This is my third. And so, third, and so on and so forth. But there's another way to write comments on multiple lines. Instead of doing this, you could say / and then this asterisk symbol. And you're going to find the asterisk symbol on your 8 on your keyboard. Just shift and then that symbol. And then it knows that everything after that is a comment until you say asterisk / again. So instead of writing all those dashes at the beginning of lines, if you want to put multiple lines of comment, you can just use this syntax here. And syntax is just the way is the symbols that are used for JavaScript here. So this is the syntax if you want to do a multi-line comment. All right, so that's comments. So next we want to talk about data types in JavaScript, and we're specifically going to talk about the 3 that we're going to use in most of this course. So let's go ahead and clear the console, and we're going to make 3 comments. We're going to say string, because string is one of the data types we already talked about. We already talked about another type too, and that's number. And the third one that we haven't mentioned yet is called a boolean, and we're going to put examples of these underneath each one. So underneath string, we've talked about a string and how we can say it's a string inside of quotes, right? So we can create a variable, and remember, if it's not going to change, we're always going to use const for a variable. If it'll change, then we'll use let. But in this case, nothing's changing, so I'm going to say const, and I'm going to say name again, because we've already used this as an example. Name equals and Austin, okay? And I always add a semicolon at the end of my line. And again, you can use single quotes, or if you prefer, you can use double quotes in a string like this. It's totally up to you. So that's a string, you know, and we could have 2 strings, right? We could say const color equals yellow with 2 L's, there we go. And then we could console.log each underneath, console.log, and we are allowed, we don't have to just log strings to the console, we can log an actual variable. So we could say console.log name, and when we say that, this Austin here, the string, is what's going to be printed to the console, because remember, it's stored inside of this name, we're logging the name. And then underneath there, we're going to say console.log color. So we should right now get Austin and yellow logged over here in the console. So we run it, and we get Austin in yellow, okay? So that's strings. That's how strings are in JavaScript. Now underneath we have numbers, and numbers, they don't have those quotes around it. So for example, we're going to say const, and again, we're going to declare these as variables. We're going to store a number inside of a variable. So I'm going to say first number equals, so first number is a variable name. It's constant. It's never going to change. Equals, and we're going to say 77, okay? And now with numbers, you can also just print these to the console. You can print almost anything to the console. So first number. And if I do that and run it, now I get Austin yellow. And you'll notice 77 shows up in red on my console. It might show up as a different color on yours to say, hey, this is a number, versus it being a string. If it's a string in here and I do this, it's now a string. It's in quotes. And if I run it, you're going to see it's white. And that means it's a string. And so that's pretty helpful inside of this console that we're using. And if it's a number, it's red. So, and there's also different types of numbers, right? If it's a counting number like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or an integer, which includes the negative numbers, -1, -2, -3, as long as it doesn't have a decimal, it's what's called an integer. That's just a bit more information than we really need here. We just need to know their numbers, but we can also log decimals. So we could say const second number equals, and maybe a decimal would be like 34.56, and that's fine to do too. So underneath we can say console.log second number, and so now we're going to get this and this logged. So run it, okay, and we get both of our numbers logged. Let's talk about booleans, because that's really the last thing we need to talk about at the moment as far as types are concerned. So underneath boolean, there's two possible boolean values, and you've heard of these before, possibly true and false, right? So a boolean value is either 2 things, true or false. So for example, we could set these as variables, or we could just log them for now. We're just going to log them. Console.log true, true. Console.log false. So, and that'll just log true and false to the console. Let's run it. Yeah, and it logs true and false. Notice these are red too, because they're not strings. And they have to start with a lowercase t and a lowercase f if they're to be Boolean values. And we'll see more about how Boolean values are used in a little bit, but just so you know that these exist as true and false, and they are not capitalized. Let's go into the next thing. Now let's talk a bit about working with numbers in JavaScript, okay? So let's go ahead and clear this and clear our console, and let's just talk about working with numbers. So we could say console.log, and we want to be able to do math. So to do that, we could just say 5 plus 6. Console.log 5 plus 6. So what happens is it does this math inside of these parentheses first. So it'll do everything in the parentheses first, and then it'll take that result and it will print it over here in the console. So 5 plus 6 is 11. And then it's going to log 11 to the console. It's not going to log 5 plus 6. It'll just log 11. Right? And if we wanted it to log 5 plus 6 just like that, we would put it inside of a string. And now it'll log this string instead of doing the math. Yeah. So if you want it to do math, don't put it in a string. If we're working with numbers, no strings. So yeah, if we're working with numbers, don't add those quotes. Now, in addition to adding, right? You don't have to just add. You could also subtract in JavaScript. So console.log 5 minus 6. 5 minus 6 should give us -1, right? We can also do multiplication. So 5, and multiplication symbol is that asterisk symbol, 5 times 6. Console.log, and we can also do division. So 5 divided by 6 doesn't go very well. Let's do 10 divided by 5. And you could also do 5 divided by 6 if you're curious. Console.log, it'll just spit out a decimal, 5 divided by 6, and it'll be accurate to a certain point, but eventually if it's too long of a decimal, it'll get inaccurate. So I would use like the first 3 or 4 decimal places for now. So okay, so division is this /. That's how you get division in JavaScript. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Let's run it. And of course it runs it in order from top to bottom, right? So 5 plus 6 is 11. 5 minus 6, -1. 5 times 6, 30. 5 divided by 6, and you're going to see this repeating decimal here, and it just kind of rounds it at the end. So I would say like 0.8333 or so, and then don't go much further than that. 10 divided by 5 is, of course, 2. So that's basic math operators in JavaScript. Now we can do a little bit more. Let's talk about a few more mathy functions. So let's clear this. And we can also say, the car's honking, so we can say console.log. And let's talk about exponents. So an exponent, I'm going to put a comment here. Remember, double slashes is a comment, so I could say like 3 to the 3rd power, which would look like this, right? So that means 3 times 3 times 3, and that's equal to 27. And to get an exponent in JavaScript, you can do 3, and you're going to use 2 asterisks. So 3 to the 3rd power looks like that. Instead of using this caret symbol that you're used to down here, you use 2 asterisks. So 3 to the 3rd power should give us 27. Yep, 27, right? And if I did 3 to the 2nd power, 3 times 3, that should give us 9. Run. We get 9. Okay, so that is exponents in JavaScript. There's also, there's a few math functions, so let's talk about a few of those. There's a square root function, and so we could say math dot square root, SQRT, and we want the square root of 36, which is 6, right? So, and we'll explain what this does in a second, but run it. Okay, and we get 6. And this math.square root, math is a built-in kind of object in JavaScript, and it has these methods on it. In this case, square root. And a method is just something that's built onto this math. Notice math has to be capitalized here. If you don't capitalize it, it won't work. So math.square root is its own thing. Let me just copy and paste that below. So this is what it looks like outside of there. So math.square root 36, that'll give us 6. It says, hey, give me the square root of 36. So this whole thing becomes 6. And then this is now 6. So 6 gets logged to the console. That's kind of how that works. And we can say, I called this square root a method or a function. We'll talk more about what functions are soon. That's just saying, hey, for now, it's what I call a built-in function. And it takes in this 36. So this math.square root takes in this 36 and it spits out the square root of that. So we could say it takes in this 36 and it spits out the root of it, which is 6. And then we take that 6 and we feed it to this kind of built-in function. Console.log is kind of like a built-in function. So we feed, so that becomes 6, right? So we feed the 6 to console.log, and this whole thing just prints the 6 to the console. So console.log says, hey, take this thing that you put in here and print it to the console. Okay, so that's math.square root. excuse me, there's also, let's go ahead and put this back in. There's also math.round. And so we can say math.round. And let's give it a decimal, right? Because you usually round decimals. Let's say 3.4. And if you're familiar from math class, 3.4 is below 5, so it's going to round down to 3. If we run it, we should get 3. Hopefully. Okay, it's still saving, so it's not running. Clear. Run. There it is. We get 3. All right, and if we were to say math.round 3.6, well, 6 is above 5, so it's going to round this whole thing up to 4. Run it. And again, how it does this, right? It says, I'm going to feed 3.6 to math.round. So I feed it in there, and it gives me the result, which is 4. So this whole thing becomes 4. And then we say console.log that 4, and it prints it to the console. So that's math.round. We also have math.floor. And math.floor says anything, any decimal is just going to be chopped off really, and it's going to be truncated almost, and you're just going to get the first number. So if it's 3.1, 3.2, 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 3.999, it's going to round it down to 3. It's always going to round down to the nearest whole number. So I could have 3.9 here, run it, and it's going to give me 3. Yeah, or I could have like 3.01, which is almost 3. It's still going to round down to 3. No matter what you put in there as the decimal, always round down to 3. The last one I want to talk about, the kind of last math function, is math.ceil. And math.ceil, it does the opposite of floor. So if it's 3.01, doesn't matter what the decimal is, it's always going to round it up to the nearest whole number. So instead of 3.01, we should get 4 out. Yep, so it rounds up to 4. And of course, it works for any amount of decimal, right? I could say 3.777, run it, we're still going to get 4 out. All right, so that's a little bit of working with numbers in JavaScript.